Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this RTS Futures session on podcasting. Over the next sort of hour or so, we're going to be talking about formats, we're going to be talking about production, structure, and trying to get you all the tips and tricks that you might want if you're maybe starting a podcast of your own, or you want to work maybe at the BBC or at Channel 4 News, or basically anywhere else. So I'm going to introduce the panel in a second, but first a little bit about RTS Futures. Hopefully this session is sort of one of many that you've come to from RTS Futures, but if not, welcome. RTS Futures holds free monthly events for graduates and those in the early stages of their TV careers. We cover a wide range of inspiring topics across all TV output: drama, comedy, journalism, reality, you name it, we'll do it. And through our events, we provide top tips and guidance on everything from CV writing to networking to help you on your way. The next RTS Futures session, the one after this one, is a What Do You Want workshop. It's an interactive session which will help you identify what you really want from your TV career and give you some tips on how to get there. It's a couple of weeks away, but I think spaces are limited, so sign up if that's of interest to you. So let's meet the panel of podcast pros. First up, Marianna Spring.
Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is Marianna and I am the BBC's specialist disinformation and social media reporter, and I've most recently been hosting a Radio 4 podcast called War on Truth, which tells the tales of the real people caught up in the information war around Ukraine. And before that, I was doing a podcast, another one for Radio 4, which is on Sounds, called Death by Conspiracy, about one man who thought COVID wasn't real and died of COVID.
And so you work across sort of a number of different mediums, right? So TV, radio, online. What makes podcasts different from other things?
One of my favorite things about podcasts is the ability to tell people's stories and to really hear them, and the space you have to construct and tell narratives in that way. And it's really wonderful to be able to spend, hours at a time with someone or various contributors or a group of people, and to really understand their story. So there's a lot of time for talking and listening, and I like that a lot.
Excellent. We'll be doing some talking and some listening over the next hour or so. And then we have Nina Hodgson from Channel 4 News. So Nina, you oversee the Fourcast. What is the Fourcast? Tell us a bit about that.
The Fourcast is Channel 4 News' current affairs and news podcast. It goes out 3 days a week, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, and it allows us to take a little bit of a longer, slower look at some of our big news stories from the week.
Excellent. And Nina, what do you think is the key, the one little bit that makes a podcast sort of engaging and listenable?
I think it's about having like a real sort of concept for the sort of tone of your podcast, and that for us can vary episode to episode, or you might think sort of narrative series to narrative series, like what you want to do with it, how you want it to sound, thinking about music and sound design and the tone of the presentation of it is a really good way to start when you're thinking about what you need for a podcast.
Nice. Well, we'll be digging into all of the bits about podcasting, and if you're in the audience and you've got some questions, there is a Q&A box somewhere down there. So shoot your questions in and we'll try and get to as many as we can. And the earlier they come in, the more likely we are to be able to answer them. So let's get started. Let's start with ideas, right? Ideas are the sort of currency of journalism, is what people say. So where do you get an idea for a podcast? Marianna, we'll start with you. Let's start with Death by Conspiracy. It's a 10-part, big story. Where did that come from?
I spent a lot of the pandemic reporting on and investigating the human cost that online disinformation and conspiracies can have. And the story of Gary Matthews, who's at the centre of the podcast, was one that hit the headlines just before the vaccine rollout was kind of widespread at the beginning of 2021 in that horrible lockdown, the one in January, and it was everywhere. And there were this kind of splatter of headlines, not just about Gary but others, saying, COVID denier dies of COVID, or anti-vaxxer doesn't get the vaccine. And I wanted to investigate one of those stories to understand how, in this case, Gary had fallen into COVID conspiracies, what he was like, the stereotypes and misconceptions that we have about who believes online conspiracies and why, and the real cost this has for someone like Gary, who died of COVID, but also for all those around him, to hold accountable the people who were accused of misleading him, or the social media sites, governments otherwise, who he felt had let him down, and his loved ones felt had let him down. So it was very much about finding a story that was emblematic of a wider issue that I spent a lot of time investigating. And I think it's really powerful often to have one person at the heart of your idea or your pitch. In the case of Death by Conspiracy, it was 10-15 minutes episodes that told this narrative, focusing largely on what happened to Gary, but then often expanding out into wider topics like the psychology of who believes this and why, or the role that social media can play in promoting conspiracies. And I find that kind of in general, not just with podcasts, but with reporting, having a real human being, a real person at the center of that, who you can build your narrative around, who there are different facets you can investigate, different people you can talk to, and that can be really effective. And actually, War on Truth, while it was different, it didn't follow just one narrative over 10 episodes. It was actually, each episode was focused on a different person. It worked in a similar way. It was about a real person at the center of each episode who'd found themselves caught up in the information war around Ukraine. And so that has been the trick for the podcast I've been doing. And I think that it sounds so much more powerful when you are hearing from real people, because when you're listening to a podcast, you want to hear about people's emotions and experiences and feelings, as well as the more investigative elements that you can weave into that.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you in a bit about sort of the process of constructing a 10-part narrative. But Nina, I'm interested to hear from you as well, because so the Fourcast, each episode is a sort of standalone piece of work about a different topic. So how do you how do you put those together? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so we're very different kind of thing, because of what we do is we will often make podcasts that are based around the work that's already being done by Channel 4 News journalists. So we kind of do lots of different ways of approaching it, and some of them are our own original ideas on the podcast team, or producers that come to us with an idea. But then a lot of it is also about kind of just being in the newsroom and kind of being in all the meetings and kind of listening to people and talking to people and understanding what your newsroom does really well, and then having an ear for what you think would work really well for a podcast. So it's very similar to what Marianna was just saying, like, if you're hearing someone talk about a really engaging case study, or you're watching the program, or you've seen something that's just been recorded coming in and you think, wow, that person is really interesting, or the way that they've accessed that story is really interesting, then you think that would work and would sustain 25 minutes. So it's about kind of listening out for those same elements, even if they're already happening in your newsroom, as well as the same way that you always come by your ideas in journalism, which is, listening out for really interesting stories or big news lines and things like that. So yeah, it's very different. Because we also do a long form interview podcast at Channel 4 News, which I'm also across, which is Ways to Change the World. And it's kind of similar for that, because that's a sit down. It's a lot of big celebs, but it's also just sometimes like really interesting people that aren't really big names. So it's just kind of, yeah, when you get a rhythm for it, when you hear something and you just kind of know that'll really settle well.
And it's the humanity, right? So it's the sort of, as you were saying, Marianne, it's that sort of personal story that actually really engages someone, because I think podcasting is quite an intimate form of communicating, and so if you're doing Nina, if you're doing, say, what might potentially be more of a slightly drier economic story, let's say, how important is it to you to find that sort of central, really human voice?
Yeah, the human element is always really important, and it's what I'm personally very interested in. I think obviously a lot of journalists would say that, but I also think in terms of like making an engaging podcast, it doesn't always mean like someone's like personal story. It can mean like, for us, if we have a reporter who's like really engaging on that topic, and can talk about what it actually means for people. Like, you don't always have to have like a really sad story or a really like interesting, like out of the world kind of story. Like, if you're talking about economics and you're talking about the cost of living crisis or something like that, you can talk about how that affects real people and describe real events, so that you have that human element, even if you kind of don't have the human element, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And Marianna, for sort of with the War on Truth, like what I found really striking about that podcast is, these are very normal people, and what you really focus on in that is the sort of before and after of this one central event. And really, you know, those episodes, the one thing they have in common is that they've been through the same extraordinary thing. You know, how do you go about creating something that's, I guess, consistent, you know, that it's the same, it reasonably falls under that same title of the War on Truth?
Yeah, so it's about kind of thinking, in the case of the War on Truth, it was about thinking, okay, the broad topic is we want to tell the stories of the people who are caught up in this information war, along with the kind of very scary war or reality a lot of them were often experiencing, but also use it to explore different facets of that. So, you know, there were episodes towards the beginning which focused on people whose reality was being completely denied, either by, you know, by trolls on social media, or even by their own relatives in Russia. And then as it evolved, we looked at specific cases of the woman who thought her son had died on Snake Island after he told the Russian warship to F off, and it later turned out he was alive. And, you know, hearing that story from her, the realizing, thinking he died, and then suddenly thinking, oh wow, he might be alive, and then realizing that, and finally being reunited with him. You know, when you're listening to a podcast, you want to experience all of the kind of highs and lows with the person you're talking to, and it's a lot about making people really comfortable and getting them to talk to you in that way. In the case of that one, actually, I remember it well because Tatiana had to speak to me on her landline, and she's in the center of Ukraine, and I studied Russian, and I have found it to be really, really useful to be able to communicate, particularly for the podcast, in someone's native language. In her case, Russian was her first language, because they are able to describe to you what it felt like, and, you know, talk you through the experience in a very vivid way, which obviously, you know, is really essential to podcasts, because the people listening can't see, you can't show in that same way. And then also interviewing people, you know, in Russia, who a woman who genuinely believed that her friend who was photographed outside the maternity hospital in Mariupol, that actually she was acting, false claims that were propagated by Russian officials and state media. And, you know, the climax of, or the final episode of War on Truth, I interview this other Marianna, this woman photographed outside of the hospital. So it was about kind of exploring. In that case, we actually devoted 3 different episodes to her story, and investigating what her friends in Ukraine were seeing and believing, what her friend in Russia saw and thought, and then hearing from her about being at the heart of this propaganda battle and targeted with disinformation and hate and trolling that actually happened on both sides, although the disinformation campaign was started by Russia. So it is about, you know, if you're thinking of a podcast in that way, you want to, you know, at the beginning I couldn't have told you what all 10 episodes were going to be, because it was quite a reactive podcast, rather than Death by Conspiracy, where we already knew, you know, we're going to have 10 episodes, and we sort of charted roughly what episode was going to say what as the interviews happened. In this case, it was every week, often thinking, oh, we'd like to try and cover this story, or someone would get in touch with me and I'd investigate their story, or something big would happen, and so I'd try and find someone that I thought could describe what that felt like. And I think, to what Nina's saying as well, it's really about thinking about the format as well. So something that my lovely producer Ant, who produced both of those podcasts, said to me the other day, we're thinking about which podcast we're doing next, and possibly doing, you know, a television, a panorama to go along with that. And he said, oh, you know, I hope they don't mind me lurking around asking people what their favorite football team is, and, you know, what they did when they woke up this morning, and you know, funny details about their life, that when you're listening to a podcast and doing the washing up or getting ready or walking to work or whatever, you want to hear those things, but you don't necessarily get those in, you know, a much more newsy documentary or telly in the same way. And that's a wonderful thing about podcasts, because it's just what you hear, so you actually can get lovely details and narratives that you just aren't able to do when you need pictures.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, in some senses you could think of that as a limitation. You know, if you've got pictures, you know, you've got another way of communicating with your audience. But actually, this, you know, I talked about intimacy earlier, and the intimacy of podcasts. You know, do you think that you can convey as much or even more of that emotion and that rawness through the podcast than you maybe could through a documentary or something?
I think you can, and I think you do it in different ways. I'm doing a panorama at the moment, which is very powerful and moving and emotional. And you know, a lot of that you do get from the non-verbal communication that you see on the screen, because you know, there's tears and there's difficult conversations and there's pauses, but you also get that when people are telling you things through the way that they talk to you and the expressions they use and the way that you kind of lead the listener through the narrative. And that so much comes down to, you know, the way you script it, or even, you know, I guess more in the case of the kinds of podcasts that Nina does at Channel 4, and similarly kind of at the BBC, stuff like Newscast. It's just about the kind of the dynamics and the way that you bounce off other people and the way that you talk to people like I'm talking to you now. It doesn't have to feel, you know, you want it to feel real and authentic and like you're having a conversation, because if it feels too kind of, and I think telly is more limited in that way, whereas podcasts are able to be more conversational. And there probably was a kind of a historic culture in broadcast news in particular of being super chatty, and being really conversational was actually, you know, not very clever or professional. And that's not the case at all. And that's the wonderful thing about podcasts, is that actually it's really accessible, and you want to be explaining things and helping people to understand, as well as, you know, talking about experiences and emotions and feelings. And yeah, that's why podcasts are brilliant.
Well, I think that sort of thing about tone is really important. Neen, you know, the Fourcast is very much, you know, the child of Channel 4 News, but it has a slightly different tone there. So how did that sort of evolve? How did that come about?
Well, it's difficult to say really, because it's so different. Even though obviously it is the brand and we speak to all the same people, and we have the same ethos and the same mission statement and all that kind of thing. We just have so much more time to talk and sit down and think about what we want to do. And our main host, Kieran Moodley, is a reporter at Channel 4 News. He's really brilliant. And we allow a lot more of his personality, or not allow it, but like he has time to like talk about stuff and include like personal sort of, where it's appropriate, personal elements to what he's talking about. Just kind of means that we can have a much more, depending on the topic, and just a really different set of emotions, or have more emotions. Like, you know, you can have a lot more of that intimacy, as you say, and that kind of human emotion, or you can have a bit of a joke about something that you would not be able to joke about in like a 3, 4, 5, even 7-minute TV news package. Like, you know, you can have light and shade within something that if you only had 3 minutes, maybe you'd have to be very, very serious about. So it just means that you can take a slightly different tone, and Channel 4 News's tone is often quite, you know, it's a bit different to other broadcasters. You know, we'll often try and be a bit tongue-in-cheek in the way that we use words, and kind of really cleverly write into a lot of stuff, and, you know, take that kind of line. And with the Fourcast, we're able to do that in a way that I really enjoy. You know, you can do something quite tongue-in-cheek with an intro to a podcast, even if you're then going to sit down and have a really hard news conversation with one of our, you know, head correspondents. You can kind of do something a bit witty and do something different. So I think it's, yeah, having that time really means that you can develop a slightly different voice.
Okay, and so sort of to turn this into you know, some tips for the audience. You know, if I'm you know, a young journalist and I want to do either you know, a single episode of the Fourcast, or, you know, a 10-part series like you, Marianna, you know, how do I identify the kind of thing that might suit either of your styles? You know, what kind of ideas are your ideas? Nina, do you want to start with us? What makes a Fourcast concept?
I think the key thing with the Fourcast to think about is you need an idea, like any idea for news. Like, you need a news story that's really interesting, that has a headline, a top line, a peg, something that makes it interesting and current and new. But you also need to be able to stand that up for 25 minutes. So you need one of, or all of, these things, which are like, you know, a really engaging correspondent who will talk to you about their work on this for the last few years or the last few weeks, or people they've met and they've got already on tape, or other people you can go and meet, or you need like a really engaging case study, or, you know, you need a really clear concept of how you'll tell that story, whether it's like a really unique way of thinking about how you'd use sound design and paste it out. You need to be able to sustain that for 25 minutes. So rather than being like, oh, you know, are you doing a podcast on, you know, monkeypox? It needs to be like, what are you doing? Like, here's someone you could talk to about it who's got this really clear news line, really clear, interesting thing to say. And actually, I think the way that you would come into it is in this style. So kind of have really thought about the full 25 minutes rather than just having an idea.
Mm. Yeah, it's got to be more than that idea, right? So Marianna, with Death by Conspiracy, you know, this story, as you say, was in the news, but you turned it from a news story, you know, an article of 300 or 500 words into a, you know, a documentary series, as it were. What allowed you to do that? How did you do that?
I think it's really good to think about, yeah, in lots of news and a lot of the reporting I do, you have to kind of, you know, you need a new top line, you need it to be fresh, you need whatever. With some of these podcasts, particularly the narrative ones, you don't need that in quite the same way. And you want to have impact, and you want to be able to, you know, tell the audience something new across platforms, whether that's on the podcast or then when you know, go on the breakfast sofa or talk to the One Show or go on the Today program. But I think that you really want to, you know, you might spot a story where you think, oh wow, I think it would be fascinating to really investigate that concept and to really get to the heart of what that means and what it tells us. And I think actually thinking of things that are emblematic of wider issues is really helpful. You know, an example of one person who's been affected by something terrible or who's had a certain experience that you can really interrogate and tell. And you know, some of the most popular podcasts on the BBC have done that, from, you know, unpicking what happened at Capitol Hill when in the, I forgot what it's called, in the coming storm, or Fairy Meadow, which was about a little girl who'd gone missing, and, you know, investigating what had happened to her. You know, finding something that really catches your attention and you think, wow, I'd really like to investigate this in more depth, and there are a range of different voices and people I can hear from. And often that requires a lot of development. You know, you need to get in touch with all those people and you need to interrogate that story. Whereas something like War on Truth was more a concept where it began with a few different stories I wanted to investigate, and then, you know, continued each week with, oh wow, because of the war and because it was tied to the war, there's so much happening that it's reactive in that way. Whereas I think, particularly if you're someone sitting here now thinking, right, what story could I tell, and actually looking at there's some kind of good food for thought is, you know, just going on BBC Sounds and looking at those narrative podcasts and what they've focused on, then the way they're structured, and the ones that jump out to you and you think, oh wow, I'd really like to hear about what happened to that person or how that unfolded. You can do it in that quite Netflixy way, you know, like trying to understand what happened in one particular case, one particular murder, or someone going missing, or one particular, you know, I mean, often, sadly, horrible stuff is what grabs our attention. But there can be positive stories, there can be mysteries, there can be stuff where you're trying to get to the bottom of it. If you think of stuff like, you know, Crypto Queen, and there are loads of stories like that where people have listened to Sweet Bobby as well by Tortoise, they're similar. You know, you have an intrigue, you have something that you want to find out, and you set off on your podcast to find that out. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And there might be a particular issue that you're passionate about, or a particular topic, and you think, right, I'd really love to think of an idea for a podcast based around this topic. So I don't know, the human cost of online conspiracies in my case, or the information war in Ukraine, and then you build from there, and you go out looking, and you use social media to try and get in touch with people and to find out what's happened and how you can interrogate it. And I think that's quite a good way of getting started. And then you start to sketch out, well, how could this work as 10 episodes? How could I kind of break this down? And you want to keep someone listening as well. So I think particularly with a narrative podcast like that, when you've got 10 episodes, you know, we were really careful about the order that we had those episodes in, and what we would kind of feed to the listener as we went along, and the details that you reveal to them and what you're slowly uncovering, so that they feel like they're going on a journey with you as well. And they get to episode 5 or 6 and think, oh, I really want to keep listening, not, oh, well, all the exciting stuff's happened in this podcast, so I'm not that fussed about the end. And that requires us, you know, it's a different skill to something like the War on Truth, where each episode is self-contained. You're actually trying to not play all your cards at once, even though you actually do want to be like, oh, it's really exciting, keep listening. You always have to remind them, keep listening. It gets, you know, weirder than this, or it's more intriguing than this. So there's a certain amount, a lot of discussion and thought goes into which I certainly didn't realize before Death by Conspiracy, because I'd never done a podcast like that with a narrative arc like that. But, you know, you think, oh, Charlie Parker, who was the conspiracy activist who has a massive moustache and rides a unicycle. You know, I want the episode where I interrogate what he has to say to be episode 4, because it builds to it, but you want to keep people listening. So yeah, just thinking about the broader idea, and then how you can do it and what you can focus around.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing to sort of move on to with regards to sort of that attention to the audience. We've spoken a lot about the ideas and how those work, but sort of how conscious are you at every point with regards to, you know, getting your audience to engage, you know, with the concept and actually, you know, keep tuning back in. And I guess, you know, if you're doing a narrative podcast like Death by Conspiracy, then you've got that ongoing story. But for you, Nina, you know, how do you get people to listen to an episode of the Fourcast and then come back again 2 days later and listen to another one, you know, when they're different, you know?
By making them really good. And then lots of people want to listen to them all the time. You know, it takes a long time. We're quite a new podcast, and building up a listenership is quite tricky. And I think a lot of it for us is about the things you have to think about in a lot of digital media, which is lots of things like metadata. And, you know, we make lots of thumbnails and lots of things to drive people to listen to it and making really engaging thing. It's like, you know, making a really engaging intro to the podcast. So even though we're not a narrative podcast, we do have 25 minutes to talk about something. And like, you might get 10 minutes in and be like, okay, I get it. It's about whatever newsline. And actually you need to be like, chapter 1, the story, chapter 2, this other guy, and then, you know, and lead people through and foreshadow it in the intro, not give it away, but sort of, you know, see if you can ask a bit of an interesting question at the top that might think, oh, you know, there's a bit more to this story than what I was listening to on the news the other day, or, you know, foreshadow that you can have a really interesting, you know, put a really emotive shot up at the top, or put a really interesting line up there. And then thinking about how you sell it, you know, thinking about headlines, thinking about descriptions. And when you're talking about ideas and formulation, and then kind of the idea of thinking about pitching that to someone, to an output, having already thought of an amazing title or a way of talking about that podcast is a really good way of making sure you get people to listen to it and come back. So, you know, each one of we try and really think about the headline and give it something a bit different than sort of the headline we would have given the news story when it was on the news, or if we were reporting in an article. You know, thinking about a creative way of selling things, how are you going to do the thumbnail, what are you going to put in the description, what's the intro going to sound like. All those things are really important to making sure that people come and listen to it in the first place, and then stick around for 25 minutes and come back the next time and start to think, you know, this is really a good place to come to find out a bit more and keep coming back.
Rachel has just asked what you mean by a thumbnail.
Oh, so the thumbnail is the image that you use to kind of draw people's attention to your piece. So like for ours, what comes up when you open the podcast is just our logo. But, you know, when we do like digital elements, for other digital elements for Channel 4 News, it's like the picture that you have as the holding place on YouTube or Facebook or whatever that you see and you click on.
It's the brand and the identity, right?
It's the branding,
the whole thing, but also that individual episode.
Yeah, and for us, we make a new one per every single episode, and we'll put it on Twitter with the link and stuff, and say, you know, you'll have some words on there and a picture and all your branding, your logos and stuff. And for each one, we sell it on our social media using an image, which we call a thumbnail. Yeah, and that's about getting a big face or a really grabby image, and then a really, you know, informative but also like intriguing or kind of, you know, very explanatory kind of few sets of words that makes people think, ooh, what's that about, and click on it.
And I think, you know, in terms of building up that audience, you know, if the Fourcast, because its whole concept is a new thing every episode, you know, people can get their heads around that. But, you know, if you're starting your series, you know, Death by Conspiracy, you're starting it and you're starting from nothing, you know, and you've only got 10 episodes to build that audience, to get that hype going. And so how do you go about doing that, you know, in such a short time, relatively?
So I think it's a combination of the way that you promote it. So, you know, we'll have a big promotion on sounds, and it's one of the first things you see when you open up your BBC Sounds app. And I'll go on a range of different kind of news outlets across the BBC to talk about the podcast, to encourage people to go and listen to it, to discuss the issues. And all of that's really important. And we did the same for War on Truth. And you kind of got a bite of the cherry sort of each week, because you'd then be able to, you know, talking about a different episode to a different audience. And, you know, the people that watch the one show are very different to the Radio 4 listeners that tune into the Today programme. And so being able to tap into a wide range of different audiences, or the BBC Three bulletins or Newsbeat and so on, I think that's really, really important for people to know about your podcast, because if they don't know about it, then, you know, that's the first step to them listening. And then I think one of the things I like best about podcasts is, or particularly narrative ones like Death by Conspiracy, is that people don't necessarily, you know, when something goes out on BBC One, you'll have an audience that tune in specifically and might watch it on the telly, and then you'll actually have people that watch it back on iPlayer, but it tends to be around the day it went out. With Death by Conspiracy, you know, weeks after it first appeared on Sounds, I'd still be getting messages from people who'd listened saying, oh, I love Death by Conspiracy, I've just finished episode 10. And so it has a real kind of shelf life. It lasts for quite a long time, and it's really nice that people often kind of tap into it at different times, or they might, you know, someone might come across it now who's not listened to it and listen to it and think, wow, you know, they don't date in that way. And so I think you build up a kind of listenership. Is it called a listenership? In that,
we'll call it that.
in that way. And then I think as well, I mean, I tend to, a lot of the reporting I do is inspired and triggered by people actually getting in touch with me and telling me about, you know, their own experience and something they want me to investigate in terms of social media or disinformation. And so with stuff like War and Truth, I actually had people kind of getting in touch with me, and you build up that relationship with people on social media, and that can be a really good place as well to promote the podcast and to create that relationship with listeners. And there's something about it, I think, that I've really noticed it with podcasts in particular. I was at Hay Festival on Sunday, and I was talking about both of these podcasts, and I think because people hear you for actually quite a long time, like 15 minutes times by 10 is however long it is, like 3.5 hours or 4 hours or whatever, that they feel like they know you, because you're talking to them in quite an intimate way, and you have quite a relationship, quite a kind of, you build a relationship with them, and you don't get that with, you know, a 3-minute news package or a 7-minute Newsnight film, or even a panorama that's half an hour. You know, that's a lot of time, and so that's something to really build on. And I think if you can strike the right tone as well, where you're both kind of conversational and you're inviting the listener in, and then you're revealing things and have a certain amount of authority in the interviews you're doing and the way you're talking to them, that's also a really good way of kind of bringing people in. Because Nina mentioned it, but I think actually personality is really important, and I think perhaps news has often been scared of personality, or thought that it for some reason makes coverage worse, when actually I think it totally enriches what we're saying, and it can make it really powerful and interesting. And so don't be scared, particularly, you know, as young people, to not sound young or to not sound like yourselves or anything like that, because actually it's really important, and people want to hear about you for being you, and feel like they're having a conversation with you.
And it's that, and also, you know, if you running away from who you are, well, actually sometimes the best stories, the best ideas come from something that you actually genuinely care about, that makes you angry, that inspires you. Nina, does that ring any bells? Have you had inspired any stories from your own experience?
Well, a lot of my ideas come from like people and things that I'm interested in. Yeah, for sure. I think if you're not interested in something, then you're not going to make the best work, right? So like everything is, to a certain extent, becomes personal, because as soon as you start researching anything, it's either really interesting or you shouldn't be making a podcast about it. So like it then becomes something that you're interested in, passionate about. Like most things that I make a podcast about, you know, even if it's like, you know, one of our correspondents is working on something that I've never heard about before, by the time I finish making a podcast, I'm usually like, I'm really invested in this thing now. So yeah, it's hugely important.
How long does that process take? Sorry to butt in. So how long does that take? So from the concept, the sort of bare bones of an idea, all the way through to me sat on the train with my headphones in, listening to the Fourcast. You know, how long does that take you?
Well, it depends on the episode. Sometimes we will make a sort of a breaking news episode in a day. So when the Sue Gray report comes out, you're just like, gotta get Gary Gibbon, Channel 4's political editor, on the phone in the studio right now. Let's do it, and we'll do it in a day. But then sometimes we'll have, you know, I have a story that I'm working on at the moment that I've been working on for ages, and I kind of dip in and out of, and quite a lot of our producers have projects that they're working on that their own piece that they are kind of chipping away at over time, over months and months. But then, you know, our sort of standard ones, it takes about a week. But while you're doing lots of different things at that time, it's not one whole week of working on one episode. But, you know, you'll record something one morning and spend that first day doing sort of a track edit on it, and then spend some time on it. Oh, and sorry, even before that, you know, we'll plan things for a really long time, and we sit in meetings sort of every day and think about things. So it really depends on a different one, but at least sort of 2 or 3, 4 days for kind of a general kind of reacting to the current news cycle kind of piece of work.
And are you usually working alone? You know, you mentioned Kieran before, so he's the sort of host of the Fourcast. Do you work with him, or, you know, how many people are the Fourcast?
So the entire Channel 4 News podcast team there's me, and then we have 2 producers, and then we have Kieran, who's our main host, and Minnie Stevenson, who also hosts some of our episodes. And then that same team does Krishna and Gurumurthy's podcast. So that's our core team. But we tend to just take a podcast each for the Fourcast and for Ways to Change the World. And we work sort of alone and in collaboration at all times, really. You know, you kind of take on a piece by yourself. And so if I was doing one myself with Kieran, and one of our main formats of podcasts is like Kieran talks to Channel 4 News correspondent about their story that they've done, plus another section where we're adding value or adding another sort of talking point, either with that same correspondent or with an expert or a different case study or something like that. In that situation, it'll be a lot of work by myself, but also, again, very much in collaboration. So I'll start writing a brief and I'll say to Kieran, hey, take a look at this. Do you think this is the kind of right structure or kind of thing? And, you know, we'll have a bit of a chat about it, and I might chat to the correspondent about it, or chat to their producer about if there's any sort of things that I might not know about that's really interesting in that story. And then I will kind of then pass that script on to Kieran or Minnie, whoever's doing it, who'll kind of rewrite it in their voice and kind of work on that script a bit and add anything in extra that they want to do, add their personality into it, or kind of, you know, we'll have a chat about it. So yeah, it's like working alone and in collaboration at the same time, really.
And I think for, you know, if you're sort of a younger, you know, ambitious podcast producer or host, you know, it can be difficult, you know, if you're not already working at somewhere like the BBC or Channel 4 to get started, you know. So there's a question in from somebody from Peter Townsend. He says, how would you go about establishing relationships with contributors in the development stage if working alone without the backing of a big name production house? And it's a difficult question, I think journalists, you know, not just podcasts, but across everything, sort of wrestle with if you're a freelancer. You know, how much work do you do before the commission? What do you guys think about that? Marianna, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think that's one of the hardest things, particularly when you're kind of young and new and starting out, and you might be kind of having a go at doing stuff totally independently or working for a publication that perhaps is smaller. And I think that what's crucial is the relationship that you build with someone. So, you know, people want to trust you, and ultimately, actually, often, I mean, sometimes working for big organizations can be bad in that, you know, there are people who I ask to speak to me who absolutely do not want to speak to the BBC under any circumstances. And that, you know, tells us a fair bit about distrust in the media, certainly in specific spaces. And, you know, there might be people that you're able to reach and talk to who wouldn't feel so comfortable or wouldn't want to talk to the big media organizations, but may very well want to talk to you. And I think that you really do build up relationships, particularly when you're doing a kind of narrative podcast. But also even in something like War and Truth with kind of one-off episodes, you've really got to, you know, you've got to tell the person about why you want to speak to them, and it ends up being quite conversational and quite chatty. And if they feel like they know you and they trust you, then that's a really positive thing. So I think if you actually just really put the effort into going to meet them, which is now possible because of the pandemic, or having calls with them and, you know, sharing some of the work you've done previously and explaining to them about why you care about this and why you think it's important, then often actually, you know, people care much more about the person they're talking to than you might realize. And I think that that's really positive and good. And, you know, it opens up opportunities, particularly for younger journalists.
And so it's about developing that trust, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes, I mean, the panorama I'm doing at the moment, the people who are at the heart of it, I Zoomed them every single week for an hour for about a period of 6 months prior to even starting filming on this, because you're building up a relationship with them. And even if you're, I don't know, just chatting about, sometimes we wouldn't really end up talking that much about the investigation that I was going to be doing with them. It would be much more, just, oh, how are you? And they get to know you, and they really trust you. And you also, when you then get around to doing interviews, that counts for so much, because if people trust you, they're much more willing to share with you things that might be quite difficult to share, or they might feel apprehensive about sharing. And that makes the journalism so much better, and particularly a podcast so much more powerful, if you're hearing from someone in a really kind of open and genuine way and they feel comfortable.
What I'd say as well about those kind of early stages, if you are quite early career and you're not attached to a big organization yet, I think there can be a lot of like imposter syndrome about like the terminology of like journalists or like podcast producer or whatever. And I think that like, you often think like you either need to kind of like bend the truth and say like, oh, I'm a producer for this place, even if you've kind of just done a few freelance shifts or whatever. I think if you're honest and say, I'm a journalist, I'm a freelance journalist, here's some of the work I've done, or I'm just starting out, but I'm really interested in your story, like have the confidence in yourself that as a journalist, being a journalist is about talking to people about their stories and investigating things, and you're allowed to do that no matter what you do as your like paid job. So if you're interested in something, like have the confidence in yourself to speak to someone and develop a story. And if you do that and it has legs, then you can go with it to someone and sell that brilliant story. And just, don't shy away from doing something because you're worried that you're not it yet. Like, you're a journalist, go and ask some questions.
Go in journalism.
Yeah.
And that, I was thinking as you guys were speaking, that actually, is in a sense an interview for a podcast in some ways less intrusive and less frightening for a contributor than a big TV camera right stuck in your face.
I was going to say that earlier when you were talking about human emotion and intimacy in like TV versus podcast or audio format. And I actually think like a lot of the time you get a completely different interview out of someone when you're just like holding a microphone like here, or you say like come to the podcast studio and you're just in like a little room downstairs. It's like so different, especially with Channel 4 News, and I guess with the BBC as well. Like if you're sat in the studio that everyone's seen on the telly since they were a kid or whatever, it's very different than being like, oh, I'll just come around with just this little bit of equipment. Yeah, it's very, very different.
Yeah, and I think that point that Nina just made is really, really important, which is that, just that. And actually, I think one of the questions I just saw in the Q&A sort of touched on this, or what training do I need to do a podcast, or what makes me a podcaster, or what makes me, and I think that while there's really important, training and stuff you can do to learn to use different softwares, or how to record stuff, or where to do it, or how, and there's all kinds of stuff you learn. A lot of it is learning by doing, writing a podcast script, interviewing someone for a podcast, listening to podcasts and speaking to people, and hopefully coming to stuff like this gives you some insight into how to do it. There's no kind of like special podcast course that you go on and suddenly you're like a qualified podcaster. Like, I'd never done a kind of narrative podcast before Death by Conspiracy, but I'd done various kind of slightly longer podcasts, one-off episodes, and you learn, and you learn by doing, and never be scared of messaging people and asking for advice and giving stuff your best shot. And if you're polite to people and you're getting in touch with them saying, well, I'm really interested in your story and I'd love to hear more about it, and here's some of the work I've done, or here's stuff I've done in the past, don't ever feel worried about doing that. That's actually the most important thing. And don't give up. If someone doesn't reply or you don't hear back, that doesn't mean you should stop. Just keep going, because it's that relentlessness that will ultimately hopefully pay off, and it usually does.
It's about just doing it, just getting on with it. But on the subject of just getting on with it, you guys are working, I'm assuming, in studios with some pretty fancy equipment. If I'm trying to do my own podcast, I don't have that fancy equipment. Can I make something that's worth listening to with two cups and a piece of string? What do I need to make something that is worth listening to?
voice notes on iPhones are very good. And actually, most of War on Truth was done with Zoom audio and people recording their side, just with, you know, holding their kind of phone to their ear like this with their voice note running. And I've recorded, you know, links for podcasts just on my phone like this. And it's not as sort of fancy as having a mic that you can sort of take with you, or being in a studio where obviously the quality will be a bit better, but you know, you don't need to go out and spend a load of money on that kind of thing if you don't want to. And particularly when you're getting started, you can do a lot of really good interviews just by using a phone, and particularly when you're kind of testing stuff out and just seeing what it sounds like, you know, and having a duvet on your head, which I know a lot of people joked about in lockdown. But one of the positive things to come out of the pandemic is actually the ability to do these things. I'm sure Nina kind of knows more about this from doing it sort of day in, day out, with the Fourcast, but we've got loads of kind of workarounds that actually make it way easier to do a podcast, even if you can't go, you know, you're not able to go visit someone, or they're in another country. Just even starting those initial development chats and building up that podcast over Zoom or on the phone or on a landline from the middle of Ukraine is possible.
Yeah, we do a lot of our stuff is people voice noting on their phone whilst they're on Zoom. So yeah, like, and I also just think that unless you are making a podcast that is like, here's a podcast from the BBC or from Channel 4, or it's a Tortoise podcast or whatever, people aren't expecting it to be studio quality. And like, people are such trained listeners now to podcasts that you can't do something with like any old audio. But if you put a little bit of thought into it, like Marianna said, if you get under your duvet, or like you talk to a contributor and say like, you can't be sat in this cafe with the music, or like whatever, if you've thought about it a bit, then like no one expects you to be at New Broadcasting House like when you're not. Like that's fine.
And you can almost lean into it in a way that actually that gives it a sort of more like rough and ready feel, you know, particularly if that's the kind of story that you're telling, perhaps.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
Okay,
and you can get people to record, you know, like sometimes you want bits of, like in Death by Conspiracy, we're standing at Shrewsbury Station and we're like recording the tannoy saying, oh, hello, welcome to Shrewsbury Station. Or, you know, there's a lot of like atmos and trying to record just what's going on around you that makes a podcast come to life, because you want to kind of hear and feel like you're there. And so there are lots of, again, I actually think that listening to quite a lot of podcasts is a really helpful way of starting, and listening to different types of podcasts. So, you know, the difference between the Fourcast or Newscast or Ukraine casts versus something like Death by Conspiracy, or the storming of the the storming of the Capitol, the coming storm, or John Ronson's podcast. You know, they're done in different ways and they have different feels to them, and you might get a sense of which one you find more engaging or that you like, and you might kind of pick up tricks. I remember really well listening to Sweet Bobby when I was on holiday with my poor boyfriend, who either kept pausing the podcast while we were kind of both listening to it, being like, oh no, in my one we're doing it like this, or oh, that's a really good idea, I'd love to do it like this in our one. So you actually pick up a lot of kind of tricks. And compared to telly, again, you know, you can't just sit down and cut and film and edit and create, you know, like a panorama style documentary at home from your bedroom at all. Like, it's really, really hard. But something like podcast, you actually can experiment with a little bit more without loads of snazzy stuff.
Yeah, and leaning into it is kind of the best thing as well. Like, you can come up with an entire concept that, like, this is a concept about voice notes on your phone, and also I think it's about like pointing to it as well. You know, if we have done an interview and it's like particularly bad sound quality because we've had to do it, we've had times where we've spoken to Lindsay Hilson, our international editor, was like, you know, on a mobile phone to our desk while she's like driving through Ukraine, and obviously the sound quality isn't great, but we'll say at the top, you know, even just as quick as being like, and Lindsay's on the phone today from Ukraine or whatever, so people are like, okay, I know. And you know, recently we did one that's coming out in a couple of weeks that both of the contributors, our reporter and the producer, were on, and they were in India, and both times, the first interview, the reporter, her house is right by a forest, and you could hear this bird in the background, and it started, and I was like, oh, I'm really sorry, is there any way we can like stop the sound? And she was like, no, I live by a forest, that bird's just going to be that bird for the whole thing. And I was like, okay, we're going to have to do the top where we say like, oh, and you're in India, and like, you know, you're next to a forest where there's this bird. And then we heard the bird, and then there was a wedding procession that went by the next interview that again just wasn't stopping. So we had to be like, you can hear a wedding procession, right? They're like leaning into it and being like, the reason you can hear the sound is because this thing is happening. In the same way that when you make TV, they say, if you can hear a sound, film the sound. Like if you're doing an interview and there's a dog barking in the background, get a shot of the dog so people get it. It's like the other way around for audio. If you hear a sound, you need to tell them what it is, even if it's like not supposed to be there. And you can, you know, make it funny or make it, you know, make a bit out of it. Just point to stuff and do things with intention, and then the listener is clever and will understand.
And that's the atmosphere, right? That's what turns a podcast from, you know, into a podcast from just being a lecture, is actually you're there, you know, you close your eyes and you are wherever the story is unfolding, right? But, you know, so we talked a lot about all of the reasons why we love podcasts. Let's talk about some of the limitations that somebody might encounter if they're trying to tell a story. What, you know, have you guys, we'll start with you, Neen. Have you had a story that you wanted to tell, but actually you couldn't make it work for the podcast?
I'm just thinking about if I can think off the top of my head of an example that we couldn't make it work for the podcast. I don't think I can really think of one, but in terms of like limitations that we have, sometimes, you know, will be a lot of the really powerful work that Channel 4 News does is we have quite a strong foreign news remit, and lots of really, really powerful reporting, which is often people talking about their experiences, not in English, and our podcast, obviously, English language podcast. And when it's the telly, you can put subtitles on screen to translate. But when it's a podcast, you have that kind of element where you think, hey, I really want to put this on, but actually the main story is someone not speaking in English. And we've made a stylistic decision at the Fourcast that we won't do someone's sort of a very English voice, like one of the producers in the newsroom, just telling a really emotive story in their, you know, Doncaster accent in my case, but you know, because it kind of just gets a bit in the way of you and that person telling their story. So sometimes you think you're watching something and you think, oh, this is so powerful, and actually you can't really do it on the podcast. But the way that we get around that is that I think I saw a question pop up about this earlier, actually, of like how much we plan in advance. And if we're doing something like that, we would do a huge amount of planning and making sure that either the correspondent or the host links in to explain what's happening. And instead of like directly translating it, saying, you know, I met this woman and she told me about when this happened to her, and then have a pause and you hear it and you can hear someone speaking in their own voice, their own language, and then kind of narrate it a bit. And just things like that, like not being able to use on-screen graphics in a podcast is quite tricky. So if you need to do a location, or you need to do a translation, or you need to say like, this is archive, there are audio ways of doing that. So that's, I've obviously just said about how we do a translation, and Marianna said about the tannoy. I feel like tannoys are on so many podcasts now, people being like, you know, I'm in Edinburgh, like that's how you go places, and it's great and I love it. Or, you know, you'll hear some sort of atmos that puts you in a place, or, you know, you'll put a bit of a reverb to really ham up your archive slot so people get like that this is not happening in the contemporary moment. So like there are a lot of limitations that get in the way, but there are also loads of ways to get around it.
Yeah. Would you agree, Marianna? What, you know, have you come across anything that you haven't been able to do?
Yeah, so I think the point Nina makes about translation is really important. I mean, certainly with War and Truth, over half of the interviews I did in Russian, and obviously those interviews are you know, almost the entirety of the episode, like it focuses around that person's story, so actually you need a lot of their story. And I mean, there are all kinds of challenges with that, from, you know, the producer Ant doesn't speak Russian, so when I'm doing the interview, he himself kind of can't actually understand what they're saying to me, so I'm kind of asking the questions in English and Russian and then sort of nodding to him as though, yeah, brilliant, okay, we've done that one, and then moving on. So that's a challenge. And then, you know, when we were doing it, we what we do is, and again, even just like cutting the audio, I would cut the audio because it was in Russian, so I would kind of cut the audio in Russian and we'd leave it in the edit and would make it so that it was mixed, that you did hear, you know, the person in their own voice speaking in Russian to begin with. And then we're really fortunate at the BBC to have a very big language service where we have loads of brilliant Ukrainian and Russian nationals who work here, and you know, who came and voiced up a lot of those interviews. But I mean, there's one woman in particular called Irina who voiced up both the mum of the Snake Island border guard, and then also Marianna, the other Marianna, and who was incredible. You know, people were like, oh, have you paid an actress? I was like, no, she's just absolutely brilliant. She really got into it. And, you know, if someone's doing a voiceover, giving them the allowing them to hear in Russian what she sounded like and how the emotion was conveyed, and really thinking about the translation and really thinking about the tone and the way that you copy that tone. That's really complex. The other thing for me is, and even with, you know, there are some episodes, the ones about Marianna, the other Marianna, were focused around these Associated Press photographs, and obviously you're having to kind of describe in quite a lot of detail those photographs because you can't show them. And when you're doing, then when I was doing a cut for Newsnight, I was like, oh wow, okay, I don't need to describe this photo in such depth because everyone can see it. The other thing with my job in particular is a lot of it is kind of social media investigations, and I'm thinking now about some of the stuff I'm doing for Panorama at the moment, which visually works very well to do with kind of showing a social media account we've set up and what it's being pushed and suggested, that just wouldn't translate very well for a podcast and wouldn't work particularly well. And I think that's why when I first started, put such a kind of emphasis on the human stories, just because actually it's about kind of, whether it's, as Nina says, someone really emotively describing something and who they've spoken to and how they've investigated the story, or whether it's actually hearing from someone. That feels so important with podcasts, because actually with telly you don't have to have that in the same way, and you can show people different things, and you can make stuff kind of slightly more interactive in that way. So yeah, I mean, I always occasionally the editor of the podcast would say, oh, we could just do this one where we just unpick this, but with no person. I'm going, no, no, we're not doing that. I will find someone. I will spend my whole weekend messaging people on "we contact you" in Russian, but I'm not doing it without a person. So yeah, I think just really thinking about how your idea is suited to that format as well. And actually that's part of the commissioning process. I mean, particularly if you're pitching it to an independent production company or to the BBC or to wherever, you want to explain why it works as a podcast, and why you've chosen that format in particular, and leaning into why you've chosen that format is a really good way, I think, across any, you know, if you're pitching to anyone, why it works as a long read, or why it works as a podcast, or why it works as a documentary. And that's really important, and something certainly that commissioners look out for.
I'm aware that we're sort of coming up to the hour mark, so I'm going to try and get through as many questions and also ring you guys out for some more tips, for the last of your tips. So we'll start with that. You know, so I'm trying to be a podcast host or producer. How do I go about impressing a hiring manager? You know, Neen, I want you to employ me. How do I make that happen, please?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. Yeah, I think it's a combination of having some good ideas, and it doesn't need to be like a whole narrative series, or even like, you know, a whole original idea. But it's like Marianna was saying about like having an idea and understanding why it will work for a podcast, and just kind of, yeah, if you're going to go to an interview for a podcast job, or you're meeting with someone and you want to really impress them, you know, you need to have a couple of really good ideas, even if it's just like, I was watching Channel 4 News the other day and I really enjoyed this report by this reporter, and I thought it would make a really good episode of the Fourcast for the following reasons. I thought you could also talk to this person, or you could focus on this angle of it, or whatever, kind of having some ideas. And if you have some experience in editing, or you can, you know, get on Audition or an editing software somehow and like sort of learn the basics yourself, and you can just say, you know, I can do that, or you can put something together that you could play to them, even if it's just, you know, you've made something up at home, if you've not made anything for someone before, or you've made something at uni or student radio or whatever, just kind of showing that you have the basic skills, but also that you like have ideas, and that you really understand the format, as Marianna said, that you're not just coming in, you know, with kind of ideas that work across the board, like, yeah, that you understand why things work for podcasts, and what ideas you would have for that.
Marianna, we've had a good question in from Ed, because apparently Ed's asked good questions, I guess. he has said, everyone I've ever spoken to or met in podcasting has had a recording issue or mistake, such as failing to click record or whatever. What have been your biggest recording mistakes and how did you fix them?
Oh, that's a good question.
Tell me about a disaster.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I can think of a telly one, but I'm trying to think of a podcast one. I mean, the thing is that ultimately, I mean, you want to check lots and lots of times that you're recording, and often you want to, speak to the contributor you're interviewing and just talk them through the ways that they can record themselves and how they can send that over to you. And it makes a huge difference, particularly if they're kind of able to record at their end, especially if the connection isn't very good. So, when we were recording the interview with the other Marianna, which I spent weeks trying to get, we had to make sure that absolutely, she was recording on her end and the signal was good, and just really thinking about making it so that you've actually got multiple recordings of the audio. So you're recording the Zoom and you've got the recording that you're doing and you've got the recording that they're doing. That's a really good way of protecting yourself against this. I remember doing a report for the 6 and 10 o'clock news that was about the human cost of anti-vaccine conspiracies, and I was interviewing an MP, and the line at the BBC, there's a kind of complex way of recording Zooms and it didn't record, and I had to call back this press officer at the DCMS and say, oh, I'm really sorry, but can we do it again? And I think for that kind of thing, it was fine, because, I mean, it wasn't fine. Obviously, ideally, it would not have happened in that way. And mainly because I was trying to cut something for the 6 o'clock news and then was very quick to turn around. But I think that when it comes to podcasts in particular, when you're getting someone to be really discursive and to share things that would be very hard for them to then do again, you really want to, and sometimes you want to visit someone multiple times, you want to come back and forth. So, just really actually recording it multiple times. And that is where working in a team, I think, is really important. And I work a lot with Ant, who's the producer of both of these podcasts. And we have an editor, kind of different editors sometimes, who'll be overseeing those podcasts. And just having someone who's there with you, who's meeting the person with you, who's also making sure that you're recording, they're recording, everything else is really useful. And I think particularly when you're out and about meeting people, that can be helpful.
Nina, tell me, now you're hotshot podcast producer, what advice do you wish you'd had right back at the beginning? When you came into the Fourcast and you were doing your thing, what did you learn and you were like, I could have learned that, wish I'd known that 2 weeks ago?
God, it's really hard to kind of think back about what I wish I'd learned.
Or what advice maybe would you just give to a young person, somebody who's like, hey, can I take you out for a coffee? I've got some questions. And the question is, can you give me some advice?
Oh God, it's quite a wide-reaching question. I think one of the things, this is maybe then too specific for this wide-reaching question, but like one of the things that I found really important when learning how to like produce is like developing like a sense of like rhythm, which is, it's quite hard to put it into words, but like when you're like editing a podcast, I think when I first started, I kind of rushed into everything and was just kind of like, get everything down, cut it down and put in some music. That is a podcast. And actually like listening to something and being like, I want to like take a breath here and like putting in more space than you think something needs to let it like breathe, or like thinking like, oh, how can I sort of like, put a bit of an echo or reverb on the end of that sort of someone chanting at a protest to really make that like land with people. Like, I think most of the advice that I found really useful is about like slowing down and kind of at every stage, like really thinking about doing things with intention and thinking about like the rhythm and the kind of pace and the tone of what you're doing. Like, it's not just about a story, it's not just about a person, it's about like thinking about how that makes you feel and like how that kind of, you can work on that essence throughout the podcast, if that makes sense.
And you can kind of get that not just from doing, but also from listening and from engaging with these these stories and
yeah, if you're listening to a podcast like and you're really thinking about like learning about how to do it, you know, just kind of making notes on things. And like, I'll still do it now. Like if I'm thinking like, oh, I'm actually listening to this podcast because I kind of want to dissect what they're doing, and you start thinking and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Like as Marianna was saying, like you'll stop it and you'll think that was good. Or sometimes I'll be listening to it, I'll be like, there's music now. When did that start? And I'll go back and be like, that was a really subtle fade in of that music or whatever. And actually, if you're listening to things, pause it and like, don't listen to podcasts with your friends.
I think it's really good advice, the thing about sort of letting it breathe, because I know one thing that I've definitely learned from doing podcasts, which is different to particularly a lot of the kind of telly reporting I've done, is just like the kinds of, when I was joking about asking about someone's favorite football team, but the kinds of questions you ask and really letting it breathe and really letting, like, often those really descriptive bits are really nice, and they're the bits you remember and they're the bits you open with or you close with, you know, those really letting someone kind of go on a bit longer than you might normally, not feeling like, right, I've got my set list of questions and I'm just going to dash through them and we're going to finish. Really listening to them. And also another really good bit of advice, which actually I think applies across the board, but particularly for kind of longer form interviews, is questioning the answer. I think there's a real tendency to kind of go into an interview and think, oh, here's my like questions I'm going to ask. You know, be reactive, listen to what the person is saying and ask the question that the listener might want to hear and that flows on from that. And that's the way you kind of get the best interviews, because they feel a bit more like a conversation.
I think also on that point, from a producer side, I think one of the best bits of advice, like, is as well to be like confident in the fact that you know what you need to make this podcast, and like don't be afraid to stop people and say, can you do that again? Or if you're producing a reporter or a host, say like, actually, like, can we do that bit again, even if it's like because there was a weird sound or whatever. Because going back to talking about audio issues and stuff that's gone wrong, a lot of the time I, in the early days, would get to the edit and be like, oh my gosh, like there's a door slamming in the background of that bit, and I'm now gonna have to spend ages like trying to magic erase it in a, you know, in Audition. And actually, like, I could have just had the confidence to be like, I am the producer of this podcast, please pause and do that again because there was a sound. Or like, you said that word weird, do it again. Not in, you can say it more politely than that, but you know,
it's helpful. It's helpful. You actually want someone, like, I think that's like I find this with Ant, you know, I really want Ant to say, oh no, Marianna, do that question again. Or, you know, at the end I always turn to him and say, was there anything else that, you know, is there anything I've missed that you think I should ask? Or, you know, because that's again a wonderful thing about having two of you in there, because there's someone else there to say, oh yeah, actually, hi, I'm Ant, the producer, I wondered if, you know, you could ask X, Y, or Z. And that's a really good way of doing it, I think.
Marianna, so I'm going to sort of finish on you, and we'll start the general wrapping up process. But I wanted to know your top tips, and also there was a question that came in before, which I saw but now I can't find, which was to do with, you know, so your podcast is 15 minutes long, which is shorter than usual for most podcast episodes. Why is that? And also the advice thing.
Yeah, so we chose 15 minutes for actually both of the podcasts, and I think the one we're planning to do next will most likely be 15 minutes for each episode as well. I think just because of the style and the narrative, you know, thinking about half an hour, I mean, for something like Radio 4 or BBC Sounds, they tend to either be 15 minutes or 28 minutes. And I think it depends on the style of the podcast and the way you're telling it. And we certainly found that actually breaking it down into bite-sized chunks was a really effective way of telling the story, and of producing it quickly in the case of War and Truth, but also getting enough out of the story you're investigating or telling. And I think Ant and I just kind of had a personal preference that we quite like, and particularly narrative ones where they're quite short. And one of my good friends was like, oh, I really like listening to your podcast when I'm like making my breakfast in the morning. It's kind of like the perfect amount of time to put some toast in. But similarly, you know, there are ones I've really liked listening to that are half an hour long or 20 minutes long or whatever. And I think it depends what people are getting out of it. So again, kind of catering your pitch and your idea to the kinds of story you're telling and why, and actually always having a reason. You know, if you're explaining to a commissioner, why do you want it to be 15 minutes? Saying, oh, you know, I think it really works for 15 minutes because we're going to break it down like this. Or, you know, I think it really works as half an hour because we really want to get into depth about this in the course of this episode. And I guess my top tips would be that when you're pitching, if you're pitching to broadcasters or independent production companies or whatever, you know, having a really grabby pitch, you know, a really grabby title, really selling it, you're selling them something, and doing a lot of the you know, the legwork, or certainly enough of the legwork to be able to give them a detailed pitch, but one that's, you know, 3 paragraphs long, where you're saying, right, you know, we're going to be, so for like a good example would be the next podcast we're doing, you know, I've before it was commissioned, I had a pitch, and it's like, well, this is the kind of grabby title, and then I explain the kind of broad premise of it, and then I go into the case studies and the different people that we're planning to interview, and it doesn't have to be a full-on, you know, here's each episode and here's what's going to happen, but you need to be really kind of selling it to them and explaining why it's a podcast and why it works as a podcast, and how it's going to have impact, and how it's going to reach different people, and the listeners you want to engage with. All of that stuff is really important to think about when you're pitching. I think in general, particularly as a young journalist, and we've said this already, but just being really courageous and brave and taking risks and not feeling embarrassed or silly about reaching out to people and pitching ideas. And it's really good to pitch lots of ideas, because I'm sure then one of them will, you know, get somewhere. And also having a go yourself, you know, you might want to start making a podcast and you might not have many people listening to it, and that's totally fine, because it's a space for you to test stuff out and to have a go at something, and to show people when you are then pitching things or trying to do other stuff. You know, never feel embarrassed or silly, just you know, give it a shot, and don't worry if it doesn't work, because there are lots of other opportunities to give stuff a go.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lovely point to finish on, I think. So I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you so much to Nina Hodgson and to Marianna Spring, a couple of podcast pros who've come along this evening to answer, I mean, loads of our questions, but there are still more questions. So maybe we'll do another one of these sessions at some point in the future. But thank you both so much for your time. It's really, really appreciated. Thank you to everyone who has been watching. Watch it again on YouTube. It will be there at some point in the future. The next RTS Futures event, as I said before, is the What Do You Want workshop, interactive session to identify what you want out of your TV career. So you can sign up for that on the RTS website. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good evening.